We are very grateful to be able to join your book club out there in St. George, Utah. Do y'all have a name for your book club?
We do. Wow. It's Women of Wisdom.
Women of Wisdom.
Wow, I like.
I didn't know that.
Well, y'all are very wise to read John Peace's book. How's that? So we have brought on John Peace, the author of A Boy from Cracker's Neck, which is the stories of his grandfather, who was a B-17 bomber pilot during World War II. But the title is actually in reference to the little mining town up in Appalachia where he grew up. So as you all know from reading the book, that it doesn't start in World War II. It starts when he was a child and much before that. So we want to welcome John Peace. This is a picture of him. He's still living. He's coming to us straight from Appalachia, from his little farm out in the small town of Big Stone Gap, I believe. You can correct me, John,
Yes.
if I got that wrong. And so what we're going to do here, I'm going to bring John up and bring y'all a little bigger. And then I am going to share with you, actually, I think I'll keep it like this. I'm probably going to take us off the stage. This is the stage where we see each other, and put John on to answer some of the questions that were submitted to ask. And then we'll have a Q&A, and then he's got a couple questions for y'all to answer. So we'll start with the first question that was submitted is just a simple little, how long did it take you to write A Boy from Cracker's Neck?
That's a little bit hard for me to just give a definite answer. Back in 2015, I developed severe tinnitus. And if you don't know tinnitus, it's ringing in the ears. And when I say severe, I'm talking about, just lack of sleep, and I'd get up. But one of the things that kind of scared me, one of the side effects of tinnitus is you can suffer from memory loss. And a lot of the stories that I grew up hearing and kind of wrote about and stuff, I was kind of worried about losing them. And luckily for me, tinnitus, if I don't try to recall a lot of stuff when it's really bothering me, I don't really suffer from the memory loss aspect of it. But in 2015 is when it really got bad. Went to a lot of specialists and doctors and stuff. And so, when I'd have good days or I'd be up in the middle of the night, I started jotting down stories. And when I first called Melanie about publishing, I told her I just really had a collection of stories, but I didn't have any idea how to kind of connect them all together. And I had stories from the 1930s from his childhood. I had stories, from the 50s and growing up and all the way up to almost present day. So, gosh, off and on, probably 5 years, just jotting down stories and just collecting them as I would remember them. And even to this day, I'll still remember a story and stuff and kind of, jot it down and everything. And then I think in the spring of, Melanie, you might correct me on this, 20 of 23 is when spring is when I first contacted Melanie about trying to put together for a book. So,
yeah. So the second question is kind of similar, but a little bit different, is when did you know that you wanted to write your grandfather, Jimmy Galloway's stories and actually publish them in a book?
Now, this is a little bit easier question to answer. I had a lot of the stories down, and I think it was over the holidays of 2022, 2023, from like Christmas to New Year's of that year. My kids were in, my daughter was in from college. My son had just recently moved back and had gone in business with his uncle and stuff. And I think we were out to dinner, and Lord, okay, let me back up a little bit. I grew up solid middle class, and my kids have definitely grown up solid middle class. And my daughter's in Radford University right now and lives a quite nice life. And my son, he's been fortunate to do real well in his business with his uncle and stuff. So, they are solid middle class. So here we're at this dinner, and all they started talking about, my daughter talking about the cost of living, cost of housing, just talking about hard times. and my son was bringing up the price of eggs at the time was over $3, maybe $4 or something. And price of gas he was complaining about and stuff. And it just dawned on me. I had kind of a flashback to my great grandmother and the stories she would tell me and stuff about hard times. And here was my children talking about hard times. I was just thinking to myself, I have done a terrible, terrible job relaying our family history and teaching my children what hard times really are. And trust me, I told them both, I looked them straight in the face, y'all are not experiencing hard times. And so, that was when I decided, hey, I'm going to try to put it together in a book. And when I first called Melanie, I had no intentions of really trying to sell the book as much as I wanted the book for my kids and grandkids, just to kind of preserve the stories and a little bit of our family history.
So just to kind of touch on that, I know that there's a story in your book that where your grandmother was being, what was it? The pastor was kind of referring to those good old days. And she's like, I don't want to go back to those good old days.
Yeah. And, they're really probably the most special thing that ever happened in my life. And the only thing, is I was raised by a woman that had a great, almost eidetic memory, photographic memory. And she was born in 1897. And she, was part of my life for even today, half my lifetime. I was 25, 26 years old. And when she told you something about history, you could pretty much put in the bank that it was very factual. It wasn't tall tales. It wasn't trying to embellish something. If she said the price of something in 1920 something was, you can pretty much lay money. It's correct. So, I grew up with her. I spent a lot of time with her. It was my great grandmother, one I call Little Grand. She was 4 foot something, little bitty thing. And she was truly the matriarch of the family. I mean, if she said something, the whole family would stop and she didn't boss much, but when she did boss, everybody listened. And,
and you
such great stories. Yeah. And
you gave her a lot of time in the first part of your book, which is wonderful.
Yeah, because there was 2 reasons I wrote the book. One was to preserve the stories for my kids and my grandkids and stuff. But the second one was, and I've talked to Melanie a lot about this, was, as great as the Band of Brothers miniseries was, and the book Masters of the Air, the one thing I thought they really left out, that people will talk about how tough these men were. Well, they were tough because they grew up during the Great Depression. Well, my granddad would say, son, just because you grew up poor didn't make you tough. What made you tough was growing up hungry and growing up with a lot of violence around you. And, 50% of America back then was hungry. We just can't comprehend half of the population in this country would wake up every day and their sole mission in life was just to find enough food to eat that day. And, that made them tough. And then, of course, another thing that gets kind of lost in history was my great grandmother and my granddad would tell stories. The amount of violence that was pretty much in everyday life. We take a lot of law and order for granted today. And, but they were so great at telling stories, showing, that, America was great, but now it was a violent world and a big part of America. And in rural America, especially, he would say, son, he said, there wasn't no law, and I talked a little bit about how there was only 5 deputy sheriffs for our whole county. And he said, son, we didn't have a telephone. If you did call, we couldn't call nobody. So, law and order was basically what you could defend yourself. And then I can remember my granddad talking about, he graduated high school and he said, son, I really don't remember anybody I went to school with who didn't either see a murder or at least saw a very violent criminal act in their life. And then I look back and I can't say that. My classmates didn't see murders and I know some of them probably did unfortunately experience some violent act, but it wasn't widespread like they would talk about in the 20s and 30s. So.
I love the part of your book where even in the out in the gym during a sporting event, a pistol went flying across the floor. And how many deaths were in the the church?
Oh, there was two, and this is funny. My great aunt, my papa's sister, just passed away this past spring, and we went to visit her. She was in a assisted living facility, and this was about a year or two ago, and she'd been watching too much news, and she was talking about how violent stuff was, and I said, Aunt Jenny, I said, wasn't there 2 murders in your church growing up? And she just stopped and thought, and she goes, huh, sure was. She
Yeah.
goes, well, I guess it's not so violent around here after all. It just dawned on her when she started thinking about, and then, my granddad would also talk about, Kingsport, Tennessee is a small city, about 45 minutes away driving time from Big Stone Gap where I live. And my granddad would always said, son, if they'd been a mass murder in Kingsport, we would have never even known about it unless the traveling salesman was coming through. He said we were too poor to have to have a subscription to a newspaper. We didn't have a radio at that time. No TV, of course, didn't exist. And he said, so, nowadays, if something real bad happens in Seattle, Washington, it's on your phone immediately. And so we get bombarded with bad news so much from all over the world. And he said, son, the only world we knew about was Crackers Neck. And
So different
yeah.
nowadays.
Yeah, so different now.
So this next question might be a little hard to answer, but we're still interested. What would be your favorite story that your grandfather, Captain Jimmy Galloway, told you? Do you have a favorite?
Well, you're right. That was probably the toughest question you gave me as far as to narrow down. First of all, my granddad was a very stoic man. He loved telling stories, but he wasn't a jokester. He didn't tell jokes. He wasn't a kidder. Now, he didn't mind telling stories that might kid about something, but he wasn't. But he was a very serious person. And of all the stories, and I kind of want to narrow it down to the stories I put in a book. Probably my favorite one, he was talking the chapter Magic Planes Without Propellers, because we would be milking cows. And I heard this story many, many times. When you milk cows together 8 to 10 hours a day, you talk to each other a lot. And so he would tell that story. And so here was this stoic man. And that was the only story that he would really get physically. He would tell the story. He'd go, oh, when they came after us, I banked the plane down. I dove, and there was a big cloud bank at about 10,000 feet, 10 or 15, I can't remember right now. And, so he would get very animated during that story. And that was really the only story I saw him do the physical part. He was always a very good storyteller, but that one he would actually kind of get physical. And it kind of reminded me in Masters of the Air when Rosie was, when he dove the plane and did the big turn to get away from the Nazi fighter planes and stuff. So my granddad, that's just my favorite story of him telling, because he would get so physically involved in the story and would kind of show with his hands and all that. So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can see why that would be just so entertaining.
And then, of course, him talking about Tex pulling out the guns and the jokes. And, so, I mean, here right in the middle of this, terror and carnage, they're cracking jokes with each other. But anyway, the way he would tell it would be very funny and stuff.
Well, and that
I
might actually help answer this question
Yeah.
of how were you able to remember so many fantastic details in your story? Because in your book, you write it so that we're actually there experiencing it right alongside of them. So
Yeah.
a lot of
Now,
detail.
a little bit of background. When I say I grew up on a farm, I really grew up on a farm, and I spent, stayed the night at his house. I was kind of like Papa's little boy. And my earliest memory is riding on his lap on the tractor and stuff, and on the fender, and whether it be in the truck, and of course milking cows and working beside him. So trust me, I mean, and it was kind of funny. I mean, he would tell the same story sometimes over and over, and like I put in a book, and it never dawned on me to ever say, "Oh, I've heard this before." Because I was almost as fascinated, it's kind of like that favorite movie or favorite song that you might have. It doesn't matter how many times it comes on. you just enjoy hearing it, or you enjoy watching that movie many, many times. Now, everybody else is going, gosh, you must be crazy. But I just enjoyed hearing those same stories over and over. And I was a little bit fascinated by him. Now, of course, he did not start talking about the World War II stories until I was like in 8th grade in high school. But the other stories in the book from growing up and growing up during the Great Depression, I heard them from childhood, from my earliest memory on. So pretty easy to kind of write a story when you've heard it many, many times.
Yeah, I thought that might be the case. So I have a couple more questions for
Okay.
you, and then we are going to open it up to the book club if they have any additional questions to ask you. And then you've got a couple questions for them as
Yeah.
well. So, all right. So this next one is another one that you have to kind of think about. What accomplishment do you think Captain Jimmy Galloway is most proud of?
Okay. It's not a personal accomplishment, but he was most proud of his grandkids. Now, I'm not saying he did not love his children. I've had some time to reflect about, why he started telling me these stories, late in life for him. And why did he start doing it? And I think a little bit, he wanted to tell those stories because now my mom and my aunt and my uncle, he had 3 children, they would all say he was a great dad. I've never heard him, say otherwise and stuff, but he was probably not a emotionally close dad. He was, like I say, very stoic, very factual, but probably not a lovey-dovey, type of father and stuff. Work and family and everything had its compartment and everything. And he cared about his children, but like by today's standards. So I think when he started telling me them stories, I think he was trying to explain, at least to me, and I think he wanted me to relate to the family of why maybe he wasn't so close and he was so kind of reserved and kind of stoic. And I can't even remember when I first started getting told the stories and stuff, my aunt and uncle and stuff, they were like, I wouldn't say jealous was the right word, but they were like, how do you know so much? And why is he telling you and stuff? But I think he just wanted me to kind of know and pass it on. Talking about the grandkids. By the time he got grandkids, I think, he'd come to terms with what we would call PTSD nowadays. And he was such a different person as a grandfather. And he'd always say, there's nothing like grandkids. And well, one day we were milking cows and he said that exact statement. And I said, what do you mean by that? There's nothing like grandkids. And he said, well, I'll tell you this story, son. He said, I can remember when your Uncle Jimmy was playing a big high school basketball game against the rivals from up in the county for the district championship. And he said, I can remember being up in the stands. And all I could worry about was how I was going to make that mortgage payment next week. And he said, I couldn't even tell you nothing about that game because I had my mind elsewhere. Well, with grandkids, he said, son, and I truly believe he meant this. He said, son, they could be foreclosing on my house tomorrow and I wouldn't care because it'd be all about them grandkids and watching that ball game. So, I think, he'd come to terms with it. He'd realized how much he probably had missed being a father to his own children. And he was definitely going to make it up, being the best grandfather he could be. And he was for me and a great grandfather to my children. So.
Well, I know we got a lot of grandparents in this book club, so I'm sure they completely understand what you just described. All right. Next question. Did your grandfather stay close to his B-17 crew of Little Helen after the war?
It would make a better story if I could say yes, he did. I can remember him, talking a little bit about him, and there was, I think it was his co-pilot. And I was real young when he actually visited him on the farm and stuff, but they did not stay close together. And the more I talked to other veterans that had suffered through traumatic experiences in the war, a lot of them didn't. And if y'all ever watched the series, the sitcom MASH. And I rewatched the last episode that was an hour long, not too long ago. And the 2 main characters, Hawkeye and BJ. you know, they were making all these plans of when they were going home, how they do a reunion and the families get together. And BJ and Hawkeye had that real serious moment, and they looked at each other and said, "You do probably realize this is the last time we'll see each other." And they both kind of agreed. And, you know, reunions was never going to be something he did. And I don't think his fellow crew members, which suffered like he did too, you know, they closed that chapter of their life and went on with their life and stuff. And, you know, looking back and what we know about PTSD now, you know, I think that was just part of them suffering. And they just, the thought of even visiting each other would just open up old wounds that they'd rather leave closed. So, and I think that was my grandfather's case too. So the answer is no, they didn't stay close. Yeah.
I find that surprising. You'd think that going through such trauma together would bond you. I know they have a great bond in war, but sadly, PTSD gets in the way. And yeah, and it's actually so good for them to talk. And but we just didn't have the understanding that we do today, I think, as far as what helps with PTSD. So that's not uncommon. Well, I'm going to open up the stage here and give y'all a chance. Did you have any additional questions that you'd like to ask John?
Okay, I have one.
Yes.
Did you go into the military or your children go into the military?
My children did not. Now, I had all attentions. I was actually going to go to Air Force Academy.
Okay.
But my junior year in high school, playing high school football, I did exactly what my granddad did. I tore my ACL in my knee. And back then, there really wasn't a good surgery. In fact, you know, back then, the surgery could be worse than just living without it. So I could not pass the physical to get into the academy and stuff at that time.
You are blessed. Yeah.
Well, yes and no. You know, I look back, you know, my granddad, you know, probably the only question he had in his life was if he'd stayed in the military. Now, my grandmother wanted him out, and I don't blame her. I hate to say, she kind of resented him for the rest of his life for volunteering and leaving her with a small baby. And y'all can understand that. I mean, I can understand that feeling. So she wanted no part of the military, and he actually loved it. And the one thing, even my mom and I talked about it, if he had stayed in, he loved politics. He loved the military. He had a shoebox full of medals from World War II. We just wonder how far he would have gone in the military. So that's probably one question we had in, you know, if life had, you know, gone a different direction.
Okay. My dad was in World War II at the end of it, and my brother was being recruited by the Navy, wanting to reduce submarines or something. And my dad said, "Don't do it. I will pay for your college. Don't do it." And I just wondered if you had that same kind of experience, but apparently not.
No, you know, of course, at the time I was, you know, graduating high school. It was after Vietnam and stuff. So it was in the 80s. So, you know, it was a lot calmer time. Now, my granddad, let me kind of clarify a little bit what I might have said earlier. I mean, he hated the war, but he loved military life.
Okay.
Does that make sense? And so he was very, yeah. So.
Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
When I was reading your book, I thought it's like talking to my grandpa, right? Or to my dad about World War II, but he didn't like anything about it. Just didn't. He told me about the troop ships and how crowded they were. And it was just nothing like in your book. I was like, oh, what are they going to get into next?
Yeah.
I just couldn't wait to see what was going to happen next. I thought he would die, really. I did.
Oh, okay.
Well,
I was going to tell you the other characters I kind of put in there, whether that be Bertel Stallard, and I'll call him kind of Coach Stallard because I grew up calling him Coach, and also Carlisle Clark and Ed Dickinson. You know, they did not talk much about it, and I was just very fortunate that late in life they would kind of come and hang out with my granddad, and I was very fortunate to hear some of these stories from them. And I've even been, you know, since I put the book out, I've had some of their family members that had no idea that their dad or grandfather was a bona fide war hero. Ed Clark in particular. The only it was a little bit tragic with Ed Clark, and he was the one that actually cut the gates open on the first concentration camp, and his family had no idea that he had done that.
Wow.
But
they really did shut the door, and they went back to real life.
Yeah. And I think the only way they could cope, and this was probably on an individual level, the only way they could cope about it was, throw it underneath the rug.
Yeah.
And bury it as deep as they could bury it. Now, unfortunately for Carlisle Clark, late in life, towards the end of his life, he started really having nightmares, because I remember talking to his wife. His wife would come out and talk to my granddad. So unfortunately, the last 2 years of his life, he really suffered from PTSD. And he was way up in his, probably 92, 93. And
So
that always made me feel sad. Yeah.
It never left him.
Yeah.
It just, gosh.
Yeah, I think you were very fortunate to have a grandfather that would tell you these stories.
Oh, absolutely. I feel blessed hearing them all, from all the characters I kind of grew up with.
Because we had military men that were in the Second World War. One of my uncles hit the beach of Normandy, and he never spoke about it after he came home. He just would not talk about it. So I think you're very fortunate to have a member of your family that would relay these stories to you, and in turn you could relay them to many of the rest of us that could enjoy them.
Yeah, and speaking of the Normandy, I had the one character, and he's not a character, he was a real person in my life, Bertrell Stallard, that I call Coach. He was in the beaches of Normandy, and I can remember after Saving Private Ryan came out, I ran into his wife at the grocery store. How it is, small communities, and you cross paths, and she said, "Oh yeah, we saw that movie last week." And, there was all these news reports about, World War II veterans having flashbacks and going to the movie and, really kind of suffering from it. And she goes, "Hey, you ought to go by and talk to Coach about it." And about a week or two later, I went by his house and I said, "Coach, I heard you and the missus, saw Saving Private Ryan." And, he got all serious. And he said, "Son," he said, "let me tell you what." And this was with no ego, no bravado. He was just having a serious conversation. He said, "That was exactly the way it was." He said, "I can't tell you how much that movie is spot on." And I said, "Well, Coach, did it kind of bother you and stuff?" And you have to know Coach. Coach grew up about as hard as a human being could grow up as far as hungry. And I said, "Did it bother you watching it?" He looked at me with so seriousness, and he just looked me in the eye. He said, "Son," he said, "the only thing I can tell you is the day after the invasion, I'm sitting in a foxhole. I got plenty to eat and new boots on my feet." And he said, "If it wasn't for the killing, it wouldn't have been half bad." And, and he wasn't saying that to be like tough with me or be bravado or be macho, whatever you want to say. He truly meant that. It's hard to imagine growing up so hungry that you could go through that experience. And the only thing you're thinking about the day after is, man, this ain't too, at least I got new boots on my feet. And a lot of these men I grew up with, boots was a big thing. They never had them as children, and just having food and having boots was you made it in life if you didn't have to worry about them two things. So.
Wow.
Do you think that's why a lot of people from that era made the military a career afterward?
Oh, absolutely.
Provided for them.
Yeah. Melanie and I, we did a earlier YouTube video on the actor Charles Bronson. And I did not know that, he was in the military also. He was in the Pacific B-29, and he grew up the same way some of these men, dirt poor, hungry, entered the coal mines in Pennsylvania at age 10. Now, can you imagine age 10 working in the coal mines? And they did here in Appalachia too. They would take them as young as 10. They would be the rock pickers. And also they would run the ponies back and forth in. But Charles Bronson was talking about, he started in the coal mines at 10, worked there for 12 years before World War II broke out, and he entered the service. And in a lot of the interviews, he talked about he had never had it so good in his life as wartime military. He said that I had clothes, I had 3 meals a day, and and all of them would talk about the mess halls, the amount of food just, and, of course I wrote a little bit about how the men would just stuff their pockets full. And now here's one thing. My granddad and his siblings never went hungry. They didn't have cash money, but they were never hungry. But around them, they grew up seeing a lot of hunger. And so I think, that was what made them tough. And really, that preconditioned them to go through what they did in World War II. And I know that did with Coach, Virgil Stallard. I couldn't imagine. And when my granddad said if he'd had 1,000 Coach Stallards, he could have won the war by himself. I think he might have been close to it. And Virgil was a big man back in the day. Yeah.
So did you have to coax stories out of your grandfather, or did he just freely tell them to you?
Once they started, they never stopped.
Oh, okay. And you
and trust me, it wouldn't stop if it was the same story he told me yesterday. I mean, and then like milking cows, it was kind of my entertainment and stuff. Him telling the stories. But now, when I put in the beginning of the book about that first story happened exactly that. We were watching satellite antenna. We didn't have cable TV where we lived, but we had the great big old huge satellite antennas out in the yard. And back then you could get all the channels for free. You just point that satellite up there, you got them all. And we were flipping through the channels and it landed on that horse show. It was, and it was in outskirts of London, England, at this Blue Blood Country Club. And my granddad really looked, he said, "I've been there." And I was like, "Heck, you've been there. What are you talking about? Been there?" Because it didn't dawn on me. I knew he'd been in war. I knew he'd been a pilot. I knew the basics. But once he told that first story, then they, stuff would just pop in his head. And I think I think he just wanted to get it out there. I really do.
Did you record him at all, or you put it down?
Yeah, well, we did, and we had it on old cassette tapes, and it got stored somewhere that I wouldn't have put it, but anyway, and then they got wet and they got damaged. So yeah, I know. And I've even took them to a recovery specialist, and I was willing to spend some money trying to get them restored, but they were too far damaged. Yeah. Yeah, I wish I could have. And then when I went down to the 8th Air Force Museum, I think it's Cooley, Georgia, but it's between Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina. They had all those videos of the World War II 8th Air Force men telling stories, and kind of broke my heart that I could have had them recorded and could have preserved them that way. So I did the next best thing. Melanie did a great job on the book.
And you did a good job.
Yes.
The writing was really good.
Well, I appreciate that, but now a lot of that's Melanie. And then Melanie had the great idea about the gray boxes, because I had no idea how to kind of merge modern day stories with old stories. And that was just a genius on her part to kind of make it fit together.
Yeah.
Well, Jill, right over there,
Yeah.
has history of what your grandpa went through only from the ground.
Wow.
Special newspaper that she wanted to share with you, because you've probably never seen anything like that.
No, I have not.
It's another side of the story. I was born in Norwich during the war.
Yeah.
At my grandma and grandpa's house. And probably a few hours after I was born, the air raid siren sounded, and my grandpa grabbed me to take me to the shelter and told my mother she had to stay there because she just had a baby. So she stayed there, and I don't think the bombs dropped at that point. But this is a special edition of the newspaper in 2002. And it says 60 years on, we remember a city under siege. Most people, when they think of bombing, they think of London.
Yes.
Well, Norwich was on the map for being bombed. It said, let's see. I'll just read some of this. Stung by the increasing severity of British air raids over Nazi Germany, Hitler's Luftwaffe High Command decided to strike back. They began poring over Baedeker's Guide to Britain, an excellent publication produced for tourists before the war. Representatives had even visited Norwich to take a good look around to this fine city, taking a note of all the points of interest in the 1930s. The Luftwaffe noticed that in the book, Norwich had been described as a place of great historical interest. So they loaded their bombers and they set off over 2 nights in April of 1942 to destroy as much of Norwich as they could. They called them the Baedeker raids after the guide that they had. It was the people who suffered the most as the bombers missed the city hall, the castle, and the cathedral, dropping much of their deadly load on residential streets. Despite the preparations, there was little anyone could do to prevent the attacks. High explosive bombs destroyed large chunks of the city center. Streets and roads were flattened. Men, women, and children were killed or maimed. The Norwich Blitz left a battered city with broken lives, but the Luftwaffe had failed to break the spirit of the people, who were more determined than ever to win the war. During this time, there were 35,569 houses in Norwich. And of that, 30,354 were totally damaged or partly destroyed.
Wow.
This is written by people who remembered these raids. This is one thing that one person wrote. It was approaching midnight on a moonlit spring evening, and the people of Norwich were getting ready for bed. As the lights went out across the city, a deadly airborne convoy was already on its way, its mission to destroy as much of Norwich as possible. The date was Monday, April 27th, 1942. In previous months, there had been a lull in enemy action over the city, and there were those who had started to ignore the sirens, called moaning minis, and not bother to seek shelter. That night, they did so at their peril. The shadow of death was being cast over the city. A week of living hell that would change the face of Norwich forever, bringing chaos and destruction, was about to start. Life would never be the same. The deep rhythmic note of the powerful engines in the sky was ominous. Between 25 and 30 planes were over the city. Parachute flares lit up the city, and once the attack had begun, there could be no doubt to its gravity. First, there was a mechanical scream of heavy missiles hurtling down on streets and roofs, yards and gardens. This was followed by shattering explosions, usually in series, as the stick of bombs took effect. At the same time, a rain of silver fire indicated the course of the incendiaries, and in a short space of time, the orange glow of great fires could be seen across the fields and villages surrounding Norwich. The city was on fire. The emergency services struggled to cope as the raid carried on. Rows of houses were destroyed, factories were burning. For over 2 hours, the Luftwaffe pounded Norwich, dropping 185 bombs, weighing over 50 tons. At 1:25 a.m., the all clear sounded. Then the grim rescue work started. Mountains of rubble had to be dug and shifted. Official records say 162 people had been killed and 600 badly hurt, many with appalling injuries. Hundreds were homeless, and even the mortuary had been put out of action. Few people had running water as the mains were smashed. A dazed city roused itself on Tuesday. By some miracle, all the landmarks survived: the cathedral, the castle, St. Peter Mancroft, and the city hall. The destitute and the bereaved, grief-stricken and bewildered began queuing. Over 14,000 emergency ration cards were issued. So many only had the clothes they stood up in, and they couldn't get any more because the shops were destroyed. The people had little time to regain their senses. Smoke was still coming from the rubble when the bombers returned the next day. This time there was some attempt at defense, but the anti-aircraft fire did little to stop the attack, which resulted in 69 more deaths and injuring 90 more people. About 112 high explosive bombs with a higher number of incendiaries weighing over 45 tons dropped across the city, flattening huge areas. Eyewitnesses said the second attack, although 45 minutes shorter and claiming fewer lives was more spectacular and devastating than the first. The lights of flames flickered through jagged gaps in familiar walls and reflected in pools of water, the crunch of broken glass and plaster beneath wheels of feet. The roar of the conflagration and the shouted orders and warnings were ominously reminiscent of the First World War. Following the raids on Tuesday, Wednesday, and the smaller one on Thursday, guns and barrage balloons were moved into position around Norwich, but by then it was too late. The city was smoldering. Water shortages handicapped the firefighting. The electricity and sewer systems had been hit. The gas company was struggling to cope. The emergency and relief services were stretched to the limits, and at nights, women and children pushing prams, barrows, or homemade carts containing what was left of their possessions headed out of the city to sleep in the fields. For days, vans equipped with loudspeakers toured the streets, giving advice about boiling water and where they could get help. Then it was time for the people of Norwich to bury their dead. This was our darkest hour. We'll remember them.
Jeez. You want to show them that picture?
Oh, there's a whole lot of pictures in here.
Wow. Yeah, I can see. Yeah.
Yeah, it's real.
That's sobering.
I'm glad your grandpa was in the air getting back at them.
Yeah,
I mean, it's terrible to feel that way, but it was a
yeah.
war.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. But it also points out, okay, my granddad was doing that to other people, and I will say it haunted him up until probably he did not come to peace with all the innocent people he killed until he was probably in his late 80s. And I used to think, that God gave him a long life so he would have time to come to terms with that, because it haunted him for a long time about all the innocent people that, and I told Melanie, I said, when I was doing research for the book, I tried to find some like suicide statistics for B-17 or for bomber crews, period. Didn't matter if it was B-17 or B-24. And they didn't keep statistics like that back then. But now from everything that I've read on the editorials and stuff, it was real high. And you could imagine, okay, the guilt that my granddad would talk about, a fighter plane's coming after you and you're shooting back. It's easy to kill somebody that's trying to kill you. But when you're dropping bombs, and that's one reason I put the chapter in there about the bombing civilian targets, because that captain really did reject that mission, right or wrong. And my granddad wouldn't say he was right or wrong for refusing that mission. But my granddad respected the heck out of his religious conviction to do it. And he did it over, morality. We're Americans. We don't bomb civilian targets. That's what separates us from other people. And
It says in this that Hitler's minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, wrote in his diary of his satisfaction over what he described as the heavy destruction of Norwich. He liked it. He liked it.
Yeah.
There's this one thing, this young boy, he said, already we've several raids on our city. Our street had been hit. Once I was in the playground when we heard a plane diving straight at us. We all rushed to the air raid shelter. While I was still some distance away from the shelter, one of my plimsolls, which is kids, came off, and like a dizzy fool, I stopped to pick it up. By then, the plane was directly above me, firing its machine guns. It was so low I could see the crew. I stood rooted to the spot, watching fascinated as it flashed over me.
Wow.
There are a lot of stories in here, different people.
Yeah.
Word is not good.
So Jill should be at a lucky survival club because she lived through that stuff.
Yeah. I was born later than this 1942 raid, but it's interesting that Norwich was a target because if the Luftwaffe went over London to bomb, and they were frightened away by the fighters at the time, they would go back to Germany, but they would go right over Norwich and they would drop their bombs on Norwich because it was the biggest target after London. So Norwich really got a lot of it.
Wow. I did not know that. Thank you so much for sharing that.
There were a lot of airfields around Norwich.
Yeah.
The one
And also, Melanie, we've done a lot of the videos on Masters of the Air, and that book was very detailed, and you got to realize World War II was the first war that used bombing warfare. I mean, every other war in the history of man, it was mainly militaries versus militaries. And in World War II was the first time you had organized military action to bomb civilian targets. So that was the first time in history that ever happened on purpose. Now, I'm not saying it didn't happen, I'm sure it did. And I'm sure it happened out of people violating orders and stuff like that. But as far as a military objective, just to bomb civilian targets, cross new ground.
It's a whole new level of violence. And we
And murder. And,
we've never gone back to the other way of fighting either.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm very anti-war, and I can't get away from it. And as a country, we don't love war.
Oh,
we
I know.
I mean, we didn't. I don't know where we're at now, but
one video that Melanie and I we plan on doing with a professor that did one of the endorsements on the book is doing one on sin eaters. In the Welsh Celtic, in our religion, there used to be sin eaters, and basically when we say what is a sin eater, when you're asking somebody who is a good person to do sinful things, you're basically making them to be a sin eater, and I just couldn't imagine the mental turmoil that would do to a person when you ask them to go kill innocent people. Now I know your objective is to win the war and all that, but I just couldn't imagine being in that situation, having to do something like that. Terrible, terrible situation. Yeah.
Well, I have a couple questions that you were going to ask them.
Okay.
And maybe some of them have been covered, but we'll go ahead and bring them up anyway.
Thank you so much for the magazine. That's a great big magazine you have that is. I'd love to be able to get copies of that if possible.
Maybe we can copy that. We'll try.
Okay.
Big. It would be a lot. I have to go to copy center.
yeah.
So if any of you want to answer this question, feel free to pipe up. So the first one is, what did you learn that it might be new that you didn't know before or was interesting from reading A Boy from Cracker's Neck?
New or interesting. Well, it gave us a picture of life in Appalachia. That's something that we're not all familiar with, so that was really good. I had seen the series, the Masters of the Air, before I read it, so I already had a vision of the war parts of it.
Yeah.
From that, but
and that was a little bit what I wanted to do with the book. I wanted to show what made these men. And I'm glad you got that out of it, because that was one of my purposes. Because I thought Band of Brothers, I thought Masters of the Air, that I thought they should have started it a little bit earlier and showed where these men came from and different diverse backgrounds and how hard some of them grew up, hungry and with the violence and stuff of the era.
So the next question is, how did you feel at the end of reading A Boy from Cracker's Neck?
I was attached to so many things that were in my past. Cracker Jacks. Every Friday night at the drive-in, we each got our own box of Cracker Jacks. I loved Cracker Jacks. And the new technology coming out, phones, internets, TV, those were tools of the devil at first.
I know.
Last family to ever get a TV. I had to go make friends with neighbors who had one. 2-bushel baby. Oh, I love that. Jimmy was worth twice as much as his older brother. And he proved it from his life. The Savior said, remember the worth of souls is great in the sight of God. Jimmy was great in the sight of God. And I was so impressed with Ma. I'm scared to death of pistols, but there she was protecting her home and family with her pistol that she packed around on her little tiny body. And this one, church attendance was mandatory. Think where we have come to at this point in civilization in America.
Yes. Well, I'm glad you got that. And one thing I've talked to my kids about, and this goes back to my great grandmother. She was born in 1897 and passed away in 1995. And I'll ask this question: is there another 100-year period in a person's lifetime that saw so much change? I mean, she went from horse and buggy to, basically living like the 1800s, 1700s, till she actually saw some computers. And in 1995, it was kind of infant compared to what, but she, saw computers and seeing us go to the moon. And I just couldn't imagine another 100-year period that saw so much change in one lifetime. Yeah.
So the one thing that I wrote down afterwards was the most impactful thing to me was near the end when the German man came to fix the machinery.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And they talked about the waste of lives in war. And I mean, those are my feelings exactly. Why do we go through all this and just ruins so many lives? Not only the ones who died, but the ones who are affected, the ones who have PTSD, the families. War is just so silly. But
oh yeah, and my granddad, he was talking about a meeting at German, and he said, "Son, he was doing what his government was telling him to do, and I was doing what my government was telling me to do."
Yeah.
At the end of the day,
yeah.
And and now I said this to Melanie the other day. I said my grandfather didn't have anything against the military, but now he instilled a healthy distrust of government. He said, "Son, government's made of men or people that are sinful, and that means government's going to be sinful too." And he was always very distrustful of government in general. And then he said, "Yeah." Anyway,
That's it.
Well, are there any final thoughts or questions that you'd like to ask while we got John here?
Hey, I got one more quick question of everybody there. One thing I think I've learned from talking to people since putting this book together and writing and stuff is almost every family that you come in contact with, if you go back 2 or 3 generations, you find hunger or violence. Your all's personal family history, how many generations do you got to go back before you find hunger?
Yeah. Just my parents lived through the
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's anything I can distill in these younger generation is that was just not that long ago. We've come a long ways. And these are not the worst times on earth, and not even close. Yeah.
I was so impressed with your grandpa after meeting Churchill, Chinese ambassador, and he just says humbly, "Not too bad for a Cracker's Neck boy." He reminds me of my husband. He's got a lot of same characteristics as your grandpa. He stayed calm, flying an airplane. He didn't boast.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
They look alike.
Yeah.
That's great.
And so my husband says, "Not too bad for a Salmon River cattle rancher." And that's what he was. Look at how similar they are.
Yes.
Wow. That's why I like your book so much.
Well, I appreciate y'all reading. I'll be honest with you, when I can remember calling Melanie for the first time, and I've really never expected to sell any books. I just want to put it together for my kids and grandkids. Because I don't know, there were personal stories. I'm like, I don't know how many people be interested in some old family story, but I think the stories are pretty universal. Every family, you go back a couple generations, you find hunger, you find the struggle, and we've come so far, all of us. It's just amazing how far we've come in just 1 or 2 generations. And if you go back 3, definitely with my great grandmother. And I was very blessed because she would tell stories, and she actually knew people that had fought in the Civil War. And, she could tell stories firsthand from these people. That just, and, you say that to kids nowadays, that was forever ago. And I'm like, no, not my lifetime. It wasn't forever ago. Yeah.
That's so much we've learned from your book.
Thank
I
you.
look at life
Thank you for
differently.
sharing.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you for reading and stuff. Melanie's done a wonderful job on it, though. She really put together wonderful.
Yeah, we're having a good time. We've got a little YouTube channel that we talk about his book and other books and movies. It's they're from that era, so yeah.
Hey, Jill, on the stories from England and stuff, do you still have family that live there now?
Yes,
Just
I
curious.
do.
Okay,
I
good.
do.
Okay,
All the older generation is gone, but my cousins are still there, and we do go visit.
good. My
Yeah.
granddad would talk about how tough the Brits were. I mean, as Americans, we kind of go through history and taught history. We think pretty much World War II started in D-Day. And, my granddad always instilled, said, when we got to Britain, they'd already been fighting that war for 2 years. And then, of course, the 8th Air Force fought it for another 2 years before D-Day.
Yeah.
So, he would.
When we went back and took our children in 1976, there were still bombed out areas that hadn't been
Wow.
whatever.
Yeah. Wow.
Fixed. And I could remember right where the bomb shelter was. Like, I left when I was 8, but I could remember where the bomb shelter was to show the kids, and I could remember all the different places. It was amazing that I could remember all that.
Wow. Well, it's such a traumatic experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is fun. Thank you so much for inviting John
Thanks for having me.
Join y'all and get to see a little bit of what you took from it and hear from John.